Welcome to those of you here in person, and welcome to everybody joining us on Zoom. If you're on Zoom, we would love to know where you're watching from to see how far our global community is stretching. So please let us know where you're watching from. My name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it's my pleasure to welcome everybody here today. We want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva people and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamuk, Serrano, Kalia, Peon Kulicham, Ahashaman, Ipai Tipai, the Kumyai, the Quechua. The ancestors of these peoples ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain stewards, caretakers, and advocates of these lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. There's a wonderful detailed land acknowledgement and history authored by the USC History Department on their website, which we encourage you to. Now to introduce our speaker, let me introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Baring Chair in Jewish Studies, and Professor of History, Wolf Greenberg.
Welcome everybody. I'll take my mask off. Thank you all for coming. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, who is a fellow at the center, and the Center for Advanced Genocide Research organizes a very lively interdisciplinary academic program, which consists of academic conferences, fellowships, and also events with speakers we invite to campus. Today's presentation is by Lilia Tomchuk, who is the Center's 2021-2022 Margee and Douglas Greenberg Research Fellow. And I want to say first some words about this fellowship. The Margee and Doug Greenberg Fellowship is, or was, the first one endowed for the center to foster innovative research by PhD candidates in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. And this fellowship enables one PhD candidate to come for 1 month to USC to use the research resources we have here on campus, specific testimonies of the USC Shoah Foundation. And this fellowship is a result of a selection from a wider pool of qualified applicants. And we are making our choices to really foster and support innovative research with the testimonies. So we want to thank Margee and Doug Greenberg for this really generous support of the center, which is not only via this fellowship, but also via other venues. So let me come to our presenter for today. Lilia Tomchuk is a PhD candidate from Germany. She is a PhD candidate in history and is holding the Jörg Bräuninger Doctoral Scholarship at the Fritz Bauer Institute for Holocaust Memory in Frankfurt, Main in Western Germany. Before that, she studied at Frankfurt University and wrote a thesis about sexual violence against Jewish women in Ukrainian territory between 1941 till 1945. This thesis was based on eyewitness accounts here from the USC Shoah Foundation History Archive. So she was already familiar with this archive before she applied for our fellowship. And the thesis was so well researched that she received an award from the Fritz Bauer Institute. Currently, she's working on a dissertation project on the experiences of Jewish women in Romanian-occupied Transnistria during the Holocaust. As first results of her research, she already prepared 2 publications which she has in her pipeline. One of them is called the title, and I quote, "And I gave them skirts like the ones we used to wear. Roma women's recollections of helping Jews during the Holocaust in Transnistria," which will come out as a chapter in a new volume, Microhistorical Perspectives on an Integrated History of the Holocaust, and it comes out in the fall of this year. And then she just told me that she was accepted for publication for a second article on everyday life of children in the Shmerinka ghetto, and the publication was accepted by the flagship in our field, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies, published by the US Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Her research is very well received, and she received the German Ukrainian Historians Commission Fellowship in 2021, and also the Yad Vashem grant for doctoral students and young scholars in 2020. And please welcome her with a warm hand, Lilia Tomchuk, and her talk, Shades of Agency, Choice, Survival, and Resistance of Jewish Women During the Holocaust in Transnistria.
So thank you, Wolf, for the kind introduction. And it's a really great opportunity to be able to present my research here today. And I'm very honored to have been selected as a fellow this year. And I would like also to thank Margee and Douglas Greenberg for this opportunity, but also the whole team of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, namely Wolf, Martha, and Maya, for their very warm welcome and support during my stay so far. And I want to welcome all of you to this lecture, and whether it's here on site or somewhere else in Zoom. And today I will talk about my PhD project, which deals with different shades of Jewish women's agency during the Holocaust in Transnistria. It was a part of Ukraine occupied from 1941 to 1944 by Romania, which was then allied with the Nazi Germany. And talking about this topic today is personal and challenging for me in several respects. The history of the Holocaust in the region then called Transnistria is not only part of my family roots. I was also born and raised in Ukraine, and the majority of my relatives still live there. And the war events that have unfolded during the last week are just absolutely devastating and painful. And my heart and my thoughts are with the people in and from Ukraine in these terrible times. And I know this is not the place to discuss all the associations with the Holocaust that are currently circulating around all the world, be it the use of the term genocide, the misuse of the history, or Putin's comparison with Hitler. And yet, the history that is being written today in the heart of Europe shows all the more the importance of the past, and not least because the destructive acts of the war do not even seem to stop at Ukraine's most important Holocaust memorial, namely Babi Yar. And with these words, I would like to move on to the topic of today's lecture. Please excuse me if I'm not as prepared as I would like to be, and if I'm reading a little bit from my notes, but I just need a little bit of focus today. So first, I would like to stress that this is my work in progress and its preliminary results, and the aspects that I will present you today do not reflect all facets of the subject or of my whole PhD project, as one could actually give a whole lecture on every aspect. Rather, these are examples and fragments that are intended to give you an insight into some dimensions that are based on the USC Shoah Foundation testimonies. More specifically, let me see here. Oh, I actually can click. it doesn't work. Okay, no, I don't know. Okay. So more specifically, today's lecture will focus on the recollections of choices, behaviors, and perceptions linked to romantic relationships, sexuality, and the female body. And my aim is to be located on two different levels. First, to analyze the facets of Jewish women's agency within this context, and second, to examine the characteristics of their representation in survivor narratives. Other areas that will be part of my PhD, but which I will not go into today in this short framework, is, for example, the involvement in educational, cultural, and medical humanitarian activities of women, agency in the context of forced labor, and within families, communities, and networks. But first of all, before turning to the actual shades of Jewish women's agency, I would like to frame and to contextualize my research topic a little bit and as briefly as possible. And generally, there are the following important questions to answer. The first one is, what exactly does agency mean in the context of Jewish women's choices, survival, and resistance? And why is this research perspective so relevant? The second one is, where and what was Transnistria, and how can this region be classified historically? And finally, what significance and value does the USC Shore Foundation's VHA, so the Visual History Archive, have for my research project? Okay. So I will start with the first question. This concept of agency essentially refers to the assumption that Jews were not completely deprived of their choices and related actions, despite the persecution and the far-reaching restrictions on their rights and resources and opportunities. And in this context, agency is closely related to how the Holocaust shaped and changed the everyday lives of Jews and how they responded to the new situations and threats, made unusual choices, applied certain survival strategies, and resisted under extreme historical conditions. I have noted some reference to the connection between agency and resistance on the slide, so I once repeat it while I'm talking. And formative in this field was the interdisciplinary work published by Evgeny Finkel entitled Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust in 2019, where the author elaborated different patterns of behavior in the context of Jewish survival. Some researchers who implemented and developed the concept of agency have more recently also criticized the interpretation of the term choiceless choices, coined by Holocaust literature scholar Lawrence Langer in the late 1970s, to describe the conflict situations in which Jews found themselves during the Holocaust. And historians like, for example, Anna Haikova argued that in this way the victims appear passive, which in turn leads to a sentimentalized narrative. So the limited scope of agency did not make such decisions and actions meaningless, she argues. And this argument draws particularly deep contours in the context of gendered approaches to the history of the Holocaust, thus shifting away from more normative and traditional narratives that considered women and children as passive and oppressed victims. Moreover, agency can also be viewed from a different perspective when survivors, both men and women, recount what they experienced during the Holocaust. Personal selection and narrative reconstruction comes also into play. Selection takes place consciously or unconsciously on at least 3 different levels, which are not always easy to separate. First, survivors cannot tell us everything, so they select certain experiences to tell us about. The second one is there are necessarily only certain events that they can remember or choose to remember, but not others, for example. And the third point is that survivors choose a rhetorical strategy, a structure, its own an order of narration. And in the framework of my PhD project, agency represents a category of analysis that illuminates Jewish women as agents and historical subjects and allows for a more human and subjective understanding of the Holocaust. And this is important because for many decades, a differentiated view of the victims of the Shoah, especially with regard to gender and sexuality, was considered controversial and trivializing against the backdrop of the final solution. And the relevance of this field of research is reflected in the finding that gender persisted as an essential instance of experience and in some respects was even reinforced in its effect by the extreme conditions during the Holocaust. Basically, different levels must be considered in the context of Holocaust gender research. Sometimes women and men were treated differently because of their gender, and Jewish women as a group were really sometimes treated differently as men. And in addition, there are some gender-specific dimensions in women's experience, particularly related to their body and sexuality, both sides biologically and at the level of social construction. And for example, sexual violence, pregnancy and childbirth or menstruation. On the other hand, the experiences of Jewish women and men were also quite similar and comparable in some respects. However, the most striking differences that emerge in the interviews and other autobiographical narratives are probably due to the gendered socialization and certain gender discourses. In other words, the perspective of gender explains the fact that similar events and circumstances were sometimes experienced differently, recollected differently, and reconstructed differently in written or oral testimonies. It's important to say that it's a quite new area of research. So gender-relevant questions were first discussed publicly in the early 1980s and initially within the framework of a feminist area. And a growing number of scholars have postulated the importance of rethinking the gender historical dimension of the Holocaust. And the process of this rethinking continues to this day and still is in progress. And this applies to a large extent to the experiences of Jewish women in the occupied Ukraine in general and in Transnistria in particular. This field of research is still one of the least developed areas of historical scholarship and has never been the subject of a comprehensive study. Okay. So I'm turning to the second question, where and what was Transnistria and how can this region be classified historically? First of all, I've attacked a couple of maps to help you with the orientation. And Transnistria was a strip of land between the Dniester River and the southern Bug River, and it was formerly part of the Ukrainian and Moldavian SSRI and occupied by the German ally Romania. Romania participated in the attack on the Soviet Union in 1941 in June, and it's too complex to talk about all the structures and the motives, but just to say a couple of words, they wanted to regain lost territories, namely Bukovina and Bessarabia, and pursuing own nationalistic goals, which now is called in the research area like ethnic cleansing of regained provinces. And though the Romanian authorities did not follow the German tactic of total extermination of the Jews, which resulted in higher survival rates, for example, compared to the German-occupied territories, they forced Jewish women, men, and children into terrible conditions in the numerous ghettos and labor camps, where they became victims of brutality, violence, forced labor, hunger, and diseases. The question arises in which way the Holocaust in Transnistria and the pre-war conditions and biographies shape the experiences, choices, and actions of Jewish women. The singularity of research in this region is rooted on several levels, and it becomes apparent in the function of the region as a dumping ground, respectively as part of the Romanian ethnic cleansing policy. And thousands of Jews and Roma from Bessarabia and Bukovina were deported to this region, and also local Ukrainian Jews were brought from the neighboring localities to Transnistria. And this opens up a new perspective on the experiences of Jewish women within multi-layered social, cultural milieus, hierarchies, and interactions. And even more, the disorganization within the Romanian administration and in all the ghettos and camps, as well as the venality of the Romanian occupiers, created new spaces for agency. Compared to the German-occupied part of Ukraine, the Jews in Transnistria were able to form exceptionally well-organized ghettos under certain circumstances. And at the same time, the region was also the site of camps such as Pichora, which is remembered by survivors as a death camp. And these very heterogeneous conditions required from the women and generally all the Jews different decision-making paths and actions in terms of survival. It's also important to note a couple of words about the deportation conditions and the background of the deportees from Bukovina and Bessarabia, because they were quite different at some aspects. And Bessarabia, for example, was right on the Ukrainian border, as you can see on the map. And that's why the convoys with all the Jewish people had to make the journey on foot. And many women, children, and elderly people did not make the forced marches. And those who stayed behind were shot, and people arrived exhausted and without anything in Transnistria because they already had to exchange all this belongings on the way. And in contrast, most of the Jews deported from Bukovina arrived with cattle cars and some more luggage. In addition, the deportees from southern Bukovina in particular suffered fewer casualties because their community structures had not been destroyed, as in Bessarabia or northern Bukovina during the year-long Soviet occupation. Jewish leaders, for example, received enough wagons, wealthy community members gathered valuables and had some helpers around who transferred all the valuables to the other side of the river. And in this way, they avoided looting by border guards and had some more capital to make their situation better in the ghettos and camps in Transnistria. Now, the last question: what significance and value does the USC Shoah Foundation's VHA have for my research project? Generally, I aim to examine the outlined research project as close to the source as possible, considering, of course, the respective methodological specifics. And in particular, this applies to post-war and oral testimonies, which are related to complex and dynamic memory constructs and paradigms. And nevertheless, it's important to emphasize here that the unique value of these sources, which are absolutely indispensable to any analysis of Jewish agency, survival, and resistance. And the largest oral history collections on the region of Transnistria contains the Visual History Archive. And you could say that without this archive and this valuable and extensive collection, I would not be able to do my research like I'm doing it today. If you search for Transnistria in the VHA, there are about 3,500 results on Transnistria that are displayed. And most of the interviews are in Russian and Ukrainian, but some are also in English, Spanish, or Romanian, for example. And my PhD project is, as I briefly mentioned at the beginning, dedicated to many different topics, and therefore I find the possibility of the indexing system extremely powerful and helpful. And of course, it also happens that accidentally you come across important details that are not indexed, or that certain topics and aspects cannot be found under the searched index terms because it's not always differentiated enough. But still, it's a unique opportunity for me and I think other scholars to advance my research and to work in much more focused way. And all the pitfalls briefly mentioned at the beginning also apply, of course, to the UC Shaw Foundation interviews, and in particular based on the fact that Jewish survivors who were interviewed, for example, in Ukraine, were still often afraid to talk about their Holocaust experiences during the interview recordings in the 90s. For a long time, the topic was a taboo in the Soviet space, so that even family members sometimes did not talk about it. It's the same thing in my family, my own family, and certainly not in public. And Jewish survivors were, so to speak, under a cloud of suspicion in Soviet society, and it's a thing you have to think about when looking at all these interviews. And in addition, my PhD project also covers topics that were and are, to some extent, still are taboo in other ways. For example, the topic of sexuality or sexualized violence. Okay. So now I will actually start with the main topic of today's lecture. And I would like to start with the aspect of perceptions here. So I find that perceptions are so powerful, not only in terms of how women and girls framed the new reality and how they responded to it, but also in terms of the patterns of perception which they passed on as part of their female experiences during the interviews. And agency thus manifests itself at various levels in this context. And I found one of the most important patterns to be those associated with self-perception or external perception of femininity, beauty or attractiveness, and a healthy body, or better said, with their concepts and constructions. Attractiveness was linked firmly to looking healthy, which at that time of the Holocaust meant in particular having some body weight, of looking human or looking feminine. This is according Monika Flaschka research. And there is much more to say about this topic in general, but in this setting, I would like to focus on one specific moment, namely the mirror as a recurring narrative element. And in the course of my research, this element appeared in several testimonies. More precisely, it refers to the absence of mirrors in ghettos and camps, which led women and girls to see their own beauty or ugliness in quotation marks, of course, through others. I have chosen the testimony of the survivor Ernestina Sola because it connects the element of the mirror with another essential aspect of the female perception, namely the hair. And I will read first the quote from Ernestina Sola. Our father shaved all of us bald, and we looked so terrible. And we looked at each other with my sister. And I say, "Oh, do you know how beautiful you are?" During the interview, you could hear the ironic tone. Well, we were talking in Yiddish, and she says, "And you, do you think that you are more beautiful?" There was no mirror, there was nothing, and we looked at each other and teased each other. And there are already few studies that address shaving off women's hair in concentration camps like Auschwitz, which is basically associated with the loss of femininity and attractiveness. On the other hand, the presence of hair is considered an attractiveness marker, you could say. And it is remarkable that these patterns of perception were not only formative for adult women, but also for girls, as shown in this example, because when you look, the witness was born in 1935, so she was like 6-7 years old during the occupation. And unlike in Auschwitz, for example, women and girls in Transnistria were not generally forced by the perpetrators to have their hair shaved off. Rather, they did it themselves, or their mothers or fathers shaved off the girls' hair. And the reason was lice, which were associated with the transmission of the epidemic typhus. And this example connects directly to another important point, more precisely the aspirations for maintaining a good appearance and physical health. The argument is that attempting to preserve human dignity or female identity under these extreme conditions during the Holocaust played an essential role in coping and survival and is considered an essential form of resistance. This includes, for example, clothing, attempts to maintain personal hygiene, and attempts to maintain a somewhat healthy body by obtaining some food. Healthy appearance also played a role in selections in Transnistrian ghettos and camps, so selections for those who were taken to work. And survival by working was one of the most important factors in many ghettos and camps in Transnistria for survival. Yeah. And young girls could, for example, pretend to be older in order to be taken to work when they looked healthy. In the memories, mothers play a major role in the hygiene of their children, washing the clothes of the daughters, doing their hair. And of course, this has to be seen in connection with gender roles and expectations. Basically, depending on the environment and conditions, women used all the opportunities available to them. For example, in the camp, in one camp which was near to the Buk River, they used the river and left the ghetto to wash themselves and to wash the clothes, even if it was forbidden and very risky. And women made use of the forced labor, for example, when they had to do the washing for the perpetrators as part of the forced labor. They made use of it and to wash their own things or to steal detergent from the sites. And typhus, I already mentioned it shortly, represented one of the greatest risks for shootings and actions in Transnistria. Both the German and the Romanian, let me see, I have some, okay. Some technical issues, sorry, okay. Both the German and the Romanian occupiers were very afraid of epidemics and that they would spread around the local population or also their own people. And that's one of the reasons why this topic is so present in the interviews, recollections. And to avoid this, mothers, for example, a lot of interviews state that mothers would smear daughters' hair or head with kerosene, I don't know how to pronounce it, kerosene, yeah. And yeah, depending on the circumstances, the collective aspect of neglect in camps like Pichora, which considered the death camp, are also revealed in these interviews. So, for example, striving to look better, to look healthy in camps and ghettos where conditions were generally better and more organized, when overall more present. Okay. The second topic I will speak about is the sexual barter as a survival strategy and a form of resistance. And first of all, some attempts of definition in the context of sexual violence. The starting point is that some researchers state that one cannot speak of sexual barter and agency at the same time during the Holocaust. This is opposed to the argument that some women, although their options were limited, created spaces for themselves in which they could act sexually. And again, Anna Haikova, for example, states that even if these were choiceless choices to some extent, they were important decisions nonetheless. And Jewish women were no doubt also victims of sexualized violence as well, but some women also chose to make use of their body as a resource as means of survival. And there are also scholars that argue, for example, that while sexual barter contained elements of sexualized violence, it was not necessarily rape. So just as differentiation. And in fact, this is a very sensitive field of research, and as a researcher, you're walking a very thin line. There is a complex dynamic between violence and agency, so it's really complicated. And the first problem is also in this context that only a few women talk about sexual barter from the ego perspective. So most accounts are about sexual barter can be found in third-party witnesses, and there one owns judgment merges to some extent with the presumed degree of voluntariness of sexual barter, so it's hard to determine. And generally, any form of barter, including sexual barter, was one of the most important pillars of survival in Transnistria. The body as a resource was usually exchanged for certain privileges, such as better food supply, housing, very important also the protection in the course of selections and shootings, for example. And the interviews of the VHA reveal both the collective and the individual motivation. By collective motivation, I do mean when the Jewish communities sometimes influence the woman or young woman to agree to the sexual barter, even if they didn't want to do this. Decisions not to engage in sexual barter as a form of resistance is another perspective on this topic. So some saw it as a moral degradation, a form of prostitution, as threat to their female identity. And for some who engage in sexual barter, survival was the moral imperative. Okay. And my aim here is to compare how different contexts of sexual barter affected its classification and the framing of the question of morality. A striking example is given in the testimony of the survivor Gerta Wingert, and she recounts how she became involved with an influential Jew who actually was the one who assigned the Jewish woman for work. And it was in the ghetto of Mogilów-Podolsk in Vinica region, and she told that it was a completely conscious decision on her part, and there were no feelings involved, and she was able to help herself and other people in the ghetto this way. And at the same time, it's interesting, she also draws a line of demarcation that reveals some perceptions of sexual barter and some ideas of moral constructs. And I will read the quote again. And as I said, it wasn't ever a moral question. Anyway, I would have had a moral question, I think, if it had been a German. In fact, one of my very good friends who committed suicide after it was all over, she had an affair with a German officer and her condition was that he saved her little sister, which he did, but she felt so guilty about it, and that's why she committed suicide. She simply could not face herself. In fact, similar attribution can be found in other interviews as well. A beneficial relationship with a Jew is certainly more acceptable in the interviews I have seen. in terms of its evaluation. Entering into a relationship with Romanians on the other side shows other tendencies, and the greatest shadow of shame and disgrace, I would say, can be seen in this example, clearly surrounds sexual barter with German occupiers. Okay. And a very specific case of sexual barter, in my view, concerns some testimonies of or about women who married in the ghettos of Transnistria somewhat involuntarily. To speak not because of some romantic feelings, sometimes they did not even find the person attractive, or it was a much older man who previously was already married. There are female witnesses who even say quite openly in the interview that they did not want to marry the man, and who then did it because of the influence and pressure of other people. And one case is the testimony of Laura Weissman, who was born in 1917 in Bessarabia. And Laura Weissman states, first I will read the quote, maybe. And he says to me, "What's wrong with you? Is there another doctor waiting for you tomorrow? Why won't you? And there's a pause. Why are you resisting?" And in this case, she remembered how a doctor in the Bogdanovka camp in Transnistria made marriage offers. He wanted to marry her. And she didn't want to accept his offer because she didn't like him. And it also was an older man. And however, this Jewish doctor who was working in the ghetto had a different status to somehow, and also other opportunities came with this different status. So it happened that even the Jewish eldest intervened here and persuaded the woman to get involved with this Jewish doctor in the ghetto. And in the quote, you see the argumentation and why he thought that she should do this. And the interesting thing is that such types of connections are not considered as barter, actually either by the witnesses themselves or by the indexing system of the UC Shoah Foundation. And of course, the sexual layer is not openly expressed here. And however, by entering into a marriage, this is, I think, also implied to a certain extent, one would assume it at least. And it's striking because it shows a completely different facet of weddings and expands our conventional understanding of it. So, the next point I want to talk a little bit about are the responses to sexualized violence, because a large amount of recollections that relate to sexuality are those that can be understood as these responses. And the taboo character of this subject and the strong paradigm of shame and disgrace surrounding it stand out very strongly in these testimonies. And even if it's not directly, but rather between the lines, you can see it everywhere. And in the interviews of the Jewish woman, protective measures and self-defense strategies came to the fore. And it addresses the atmosphere of fear of assaults of sexual violence represented by a lot of survivors. In fact, this is important to note also. Witnesses talk much more frequently about such or similar measures to prevent. Oh, do you need help? Okay. About the concrete experiences of sexual violence. In this context, the historian Regina Mühlhäuser, for example, postulated that this does not necessarily mean or indicate how the interviews actually protected themselves from sexual violence, but above all, It was more a marker for the pressure on the woman to state that they are sexually innocent. And what I found particularly interesting is the role of older women, elderly women, in protecting younger ones in survivors' recollections. This is one of the most, this is most in such context when, for example, German or Romanian perpetrators are entering the ghetto, and then all the young women would hide in some part of the house or other parts of the ghetto, and the elderly woman would protect them just by saying, there are no other women, it's only us. And it's so important, I think, because in most of the interviews and other accounts, elderly women just are represented as a weak or oppressive, vulnerable victims. So this is why I find it so striking. Okay. And the other aspect I wanted to talk about shortly is the romantic relationships and the friendships between female and male Jews depicted as bearers of meaning and hope. And I also focus specifically on the group of teenage girls who, despite all the hardships around them, fell in love and in some cases even met their first great love there. Again, the survivors explain that entering into and experiencing such relationships gave them hope and a small, fragile piece of peace and happiness. And in this way, they also coped and resisted the harsh environment during the Holocaust. In most instances, described romantic relationships between young people developed through interactions within mixed gender peer groups, and also it was also a type of support networks, like family-like environments. And especially such formations of young people show a strong degree of inter-ethnic ties between young girls and women and young men. So I mean friendships and romantic relationships between local Jews from Ukraine and the deported Jews from Bukovina or Bessarabia. And this photo shows, for example, such a friendships taken at the end of the war in the Pishana. And the young people all came from very different areas and had different backgrounds. And it's my impression, it was much stronger. These ties between these inter-ethnic backgrounds within younger people were much stronger than in older generations. In the testimonies of survivors who were adults or older at the time of the war, there are even more rational relationships, I would say, meaning that they benefited from each other. Since the Ukrainian Jews had contacts to the local population and spoke their language, and the deported Jews spoke the language of the Romanian perpetrators, and in some cases also had more valuable resources to exchange. Okay. And I had mentioned their inter-ethnic interaction, and this is also how romantic relationships sometimes developed. It's interesting that in the testimonies I have seen so far, it was mostly local Ukrainian young women who started a relationship with a young man from Romanian provinces, especially from Bukovina. And one example is the story of Adelia Lubinka. She had a boyfriend, a Bukovina Jew named Max, during the Holocaust, and he liked her very much and courted her from the beginning of the war in the ghetto of Turin. And he was about 16 at this time, and she was 14. And before he came to Transnistria, he lived in Chernovitz. And the witness recounted that she learned a little bit of German, and he knew a little bit of Russian, and that they declared love to each other. And it's interesting to note that she also gives more specific underlying motivations for becoming involved with or falling in love with this specific young man. I read it loud. Yes, it was such a great young man. He was so cultured. It doesn't compare to our guys. So that's when you were talking, and then an older woman would come in, he would always get up and make room for her. He also used to sing very well. He used to sing for me. He was tall, blonde, so he had blonde hair. He was very handsome. But besides the hope through romantic feelings, and the young girls at the same time consciously or even completely unconsciously chose the risk to be hurt and to live through a painful separation during or after the war. After all, the relationships of these young people were sometimes very intense, but also fragile, and since they depended even more on their parents and their decisions, for example. So Max told Adelia that he even wanted to marry her after the war would end, but he had to go back to Czernowitz after the war because the order came that all deported Jews from Romanian provinces should return. And the separation was very hard, as she recounts, and she gave him a ring and gave him a scarf and some other things to remember her. And some time they wrote letters to each other, but then the contact just ended, and the Adelia Lubinka just said in the interviews that she never had such a luck and love as in this story. So. And sometimes, depending on age and environment, of course, some romantic relationships resulted also in marriages while still in the ghetto. The special thing about it is that exercising of agency and resistance multiplied in this way somehow. One might say, beside the woman and her partner, the family and possibly other Jews participated in this wedding preparations and wedding ceremony, and it usually included a rabbi who performed the hippah. And resistance here also implied the practice of cultural and religious traditions. In one case, a witness recounted that even destitute Jews who decided to marry in the ghetto received help from others because it was the Jewish law that if people wanted to marry, they had to be helped. And this type of weddings contrasts with those named earlier, such of sexual barter. And the surviving woman stated in the interviews that they made this decision based on feelings, the meaning of life and hope for the future, and that these bonds gave them just the best parts of their experience during the ghetto time. And of course, one cannot exclude the possibility that there are other motivations in the background they didn't want to speak about it. And also reveals another facet of agency and resistance. In some cases, the woman and her partner also had to fight against the attitudes of the family and other community members in order to succeed their relationship and marriage. Like in the case of Adelia Iusim, who recounted, my friend Fania Haskelevich, she married a Romanian young man. Well, what kind of wedding was it? It was an evening celebration. His parents, didn't want it in any case because she had a different background. They were educated, much more educated than the parents of this Fania. But against all odds, the couple married and left the ghetto together. And with this, good story, I would say, I would like to close my lecture and to say thank you to everybody. Yep. Okay.
So, you could stay right here.
Oh, okay.
So we'd like to invite questions from those of you in the room and also on Zoom. If you have any questions on Zoom, please type them into the chat or into the Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and Maya will read them aloud for Lilia.
I have a question from Alan Browner. on Jewish women from Ukraine who were in Auschwitz. I'm doing research into a list of 228 Jewish women and girls who were part of a work group in 1944. And there are 2 young women on that list from Ukraine, one from Crimea, who survived and went back there.
Okay, thank you for the question. Actually, no. I focused only on the part of the Ukraine, as I told, Transnistria, and in my thesis, I also had a look at other parts of Ukraine as well, which were under German occupation, but I never took a look at the experiences of Ukrainian Jewish women in Auschwitz. But I think it's very interesting to do this and to make a kind of comparison and how they, yeah. So thank you for this input.
So thank you so much for the lecture. This was really fascinating, and I really appreciated that you had this complex view on different topics we thought we would know about, like sexual barter and sexual violence or weddings even. And so I really appreciated that you kind of had these different layers and how to view them. Mm-hmm. At one point you mentioned very briefly that the interviews which were done with women still living in Ukraine are different from those, let's say, collected in other parts when in the United States or so. Can you elaborate a little bit on the differences and maybe more specifically when it comes to sexual violence and sexual barter? What do you encounter differently?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the interesting question. Yeah, it's a really complex field, I would say, and it's not every time so clear to see. So it's not a general thing that interviews which were taken in Ukraine with women who still lived in Ukraine are generally different. Of course, some are different than others, and it's a very large scale of different, different cases. But I would say that the most, not the most, but some of them are definitely closer. So they are not so openly and freely speaking about these topics, such as sexuality, sexual barter, but at the same time, these women do not explain why they don't speak about this. So it's just an assumption in the scholarship, and my assumption that it might be the reason. So the Soviet power and all the suspicions which lied on Jews, that it could be the reason for them not to speak about it, like in other regions and countries, but the women themselves do not speak about it, do not explain why. So, yeah, it's quite a complex situation.
Many reasons why they could choose not to talk about it.
Yeah. Right.
This question comes from Alison Rose. Have you compared the experiences of Jewish and Roma women in Transnistria?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Like Wolf Gruner said at the beginning of this lecture, I wrote a research article on some Roma recollections, also based on the VHA testimonies, but it was kind of different research areas. So I researched I analyzed how Roma women would help Jewish women and men during the Holocaust. And nonetheless, I found it striking that on a different side, so within the Jewish testimonies, there is so little about Roma. So a lot of Roma do speak about the experiences of Jews, of Jewish women in their testimonies, but there is like a gap, a very silent gap on the other side, and there are a lot of reasons, and it's quite complex to answer it now here, but it's the only area I compared Roma and Jewish testimonies. Yeah.
In question comes from Jacqueline Adams. Thank you for your talk. I appreciate your discussion about agency and different ways in which agency is manifested. Is there something about agency or women's agency that we can, I think, say more generally based on this? Like, I think they're trying to get at, can we say something broader about women's agency from this research? I think is the question, if that makes sense.
Like, beside the Holocaust research?
I think so. Like, about what the data tells us about, I think, agency as a concept, I think maybe is what this person is, what Jacqueline's trying to get at.
Well, actually, I could talk about agency, speak about agency in so many different cases, so it's hard to answer this question. But also today, in a lot of regions of our world, women are still seen like oppressed, like only vulnerable victims. And I think it's also very important to get to this actual, in today's life and world things. And you could also describe it with agency, but I would need more specific describing this question to answer it properly.
I have just a second to look at the Q&A. This discussion comes from Crispin Brooks. Can you comment on potential differences between the experiences of Jewish women in Transnistria and Reichskommissariat Ukraine, i.e. under Romanian versus under German control? The difference between Jewish women in Transnistria and Reichskommissariat Ukraine.
Yeah. Thank you, Crispin, for the question. Yeah, it's very interesting, and actually there are a lot of differences between them. You could, when you look at the topic of the sexual violence, for example, you can see also these differences. Like I said, in Transnistria, under certain circumstances, it was possible to organize better living conditions, I would say, in the ghettos and the camps. And in the ghetto of Žmerinka, for example, Žmerinka is my hometown, it was possible for the Jew who was there from Bukovina to make a contract, it's like a contract with the Romanian perpetrators, that German perpetrators should not or would not enter the ghetto. So in this example, you could see that this would have a lower sexual violence rates than in other parts of German areas, for example. So there are a lot of differences, and I think in Transnistria in general, there were more spaces for agency for women, more open spaces. Yeah.
And maybe speaking to the same topic, so during your talk, you emphasized that despite our normal understanding of elderly women as more kind of weak and not really engaged, for example, in resistance, that you found that they were actively protecting younger women, for example, from sexual violence. Can you, from your experience from the testimonies, tell us a little bit more about this, and also maybe other areas where elderly women kind of were active and showed agents?
Thank you so much. Yeah, well, this area, which you mentioned already, so in protecting younger women from sexual violence, is the more present and more striking one. But of course, there are also different other areas, like, for example, when the mothers of the daughters of the children, I don't know, maybe during the deportation they didn't survive, or they would get away from the ghetto to another camp to work or something. So the grandmothers of these children, of young girls and boys, also took up the responsibility, so the part of the parental part. So I think it's also a very important part of agency to see here. Yeah.
And this question is from Jacqueline Adams again. And this is more like, I think, referring back to one of your slides. And I was wondering if I could see the slide with Rosart's definition of resistance again, or what the publication this from was. So it's a little bit more referring back to.
Oh, then I need to share my presentation again, I guess.
Did you already exit out of Zoom? Or?
Oh, wait a minute. So I guess this one.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Sure.
And yes. So is the publication this quote from? I guess the person is wondering where this quote specifically is coming from. The first one.
Both quotes are from the publication underneath.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
The problem. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Problem. Should I close it again?
One moment. I'm going to take a screenshot and I'm going to put it in chat.
Okay.
Just the. Actually, apologies. Could we get this just right back on the screen real quick, just so I can screenshot it? I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I get that in chat. But if you have another question.
Does she need to do it, or?
Yeah, would you be able to share your screen again, please?
It's shared right now.
Okay.
It's still entering.
Oh, no worries. I'm just going to. It's all right. I'm going to type it, and if there's another question.
Okay.
Lilia, I have a last question. So, in your talk, in the beginning, when you laid out the framework for your research, you made this really interesting point that similar events are experienced, remembered, or reconstructed differently by different genders. So the question for me was a little bit, while I totally see the experience, where do you see the difference between remembering and reconstructing? That's kind of, then you can elaborate a little bit more on this.
Oh, well, it's a complex question. But I would say it's both sides. Well, let me see how to explain it right now. I think it's a process. So I see reconstructing like a process. For example, during the interviews in the Shoah Foundation, all this process when they're calling the interviewee the day before or sometime before and elaborating all the questions and so on, and then the interviewer can, in his mind, go back to the history, to his or her experiences back then, and to think about it and to put it in a specific order, I would say. For me, this example is, for example, something of reconstruction. So it's not just a fluent process, just go on, but with kind of, taking some parts to the front and other parts to the back. Yeah, I would say, in my opinion, I would call this reconstruction. And remembering is just the whole process from the beginning of the war, the Holocaust, and ending with with the time the witnesses are living. So all the changes and the memories and the recollections went through this time. So it's a remembering process for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. I have a question from, and I just have their username, so it's dplut. Do you have any information about local Romanians who risked their lives by hiding those in the Transnistria ghetto in their homes or property?
Could you please repeat it? I didn't understand one part.
Yes, no worries. Do you have any information about local Romanians who risked their lives by hiding those in the Transnistria ghetto in their homes or property?
Oh, okay. Let me think about it. Actually not, but I wouldn't say that those cases didn't existed, but I just didn't put my focus on this area of hiding. But it's definitely a part of the research I want to elaborate more. So in the future, and maybe also in the remaining time of my fellowship, I want to look further on the topic of hiding and the experiences of Jewish women during their hiding. So it would be actually a good thing to look. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lilia.
You're welcome.
And
Thank you.
before we conclude, we just want to give our thanks again to Margee and Douglas Greenberg for endowing the fellowship that enables Lilia to come and spend a month at the center. And we also want to offer thanks to Patty Johnson at Doheny Library and Roger and Jesse with Dornsife Media Services. We depend on all of you for our events and are very grateful. Thank you so much.
So thanks again, Lilia. And I just wanted to say that that we have a series of events coming up. And since our presenter today twice cited Anna Haikova, we co-sponsor a talk on April 11 here at USC of Anna Haikova, where she also will kind of talk about this topic of sexual barter, for example. So this will be an interesting talk. Please, I think we will put in the chat a link so that you can subscribe to our newsletter so that you get the information about our next talks and events organized by the center. Thank you all for coming, and thanks, Lilia, for being so courageous and brave despite all the circumstances to give a really great lecture.
Thank you so much. Thank you.